This audiobook reveals a truth at odds with everything you've been taught about achieving what you want, that most of what you've spent years forcing was never meant to be forced at all, only spoken and then released. As you listen, you'll uncover the power of not forcing. Don't question the universe. Just speak. There is a truth quietly at odds with nearly everything you have ever been taught about achieving what you want in this life. You have been told, since your earliest years, by well-meaning voices who themselves were never shown otherwise, that outcomes must be personally engineered, that nothing of genuine worth arrives without relentless effort applied against it, that struggle is simply the price every desire demands before it will consent to appear. And so you have spent years, perhaps the whole of your adult life, forcing, straining against circumstances that would not yield, gripping tightly to outcomes that seemed always just beyond your reach, believing, all the while, that this exhausting labor was simply what living required of you. Most of what you have spent so many years forcing was never meant to be forced at all. It was meant instead to be spoken plainly, without strain, and then left entirely alone to unfold according to its own quiet and unhurried timing. Consider, honestly and without judgment, the sheer exhaustion you may already be carrying from a lifetime spent believing that every outcome must be personally engineered through sustained and continuous effort. This exhaustion is not a personal failing. It is simply what happens to anyone who has been taught, from childhood onward, that force is the only currency the world accepts. You were never shown the alternative, because the alternative was never widely taught that the universe responds most readily not to force, but to calm and unquestioning speech, offered once with genuine sincerity, and then released entirely, without further struggle or interference. There is a careful and important distinction to be drawn here, one this book will return to many times across the chapters that follow. It is the distinction between speaking with genuine conviction and then straining anxiously against the outcome, watching it, pushing it, refusing to let it breathe, and speaking with that same conviction, and then trusting completely the quiet space that follows those words. This second manner, though it may feel unfamiliar to you at first, even faintly irresponsible, as though you were neglecting some duty you were meant to perform, is in fact the far older and considerably more reliable path. It is simply a path that force and struggle, over many generations, quietly buried beneath layers of exhausting habit. What follows in these pages is an invitation to release a burden you were never truly meant to carry alone. This is not a teaching built on additional effort, another technique to add to an already exhausting list of things you must diligently practice each day. It is instead a teaching built on relief, the relief of finally, and for perhaps the first time in your adult life, setting struggle down. Notice, honestly, how much of your own life has been spent forcing rather than simply speaking. Notice how often you have gripped an outcome so tightly that your own grip became the very thing standing in its way. Enter this teaching now, with open and receptive attention, releasing whatever old and exhausting assumptions have kept you until this very evening, believing that struggle was the only path available to you. The deeper instruction of Part 1 awaits you now, ready to show you a gentler way. Act 1. The struggle you were never meant to carry. Chapter 1. The myth that everything must be earned through force. Everett Calloway was raised, from the earliest years of his childhood, to believe that nothing of genuine value could ever be achieved without exhausting and sustained effort, that ease, wherever it appeared, was somehow suspect, a sign that something had been cheated rather than earned. He carried this belief faithfully into his adult work as a surveyor, forcing every outcome in his life through sheer and continuous strain, negotiating for every advantage, pushing against every obstacle with the full weight of his own considerable will, and finding himself, after years of such relentless effort, no closer to genuine ease than when he had begun. One particular evening, he watched an old colleague, a man of considerably less obvious ambition and considerably less visible effort, achieve, through a single calm and quietly spoken statement, precisely the outcome Everett himself had been forcing unsuccessfully for many exhausting months. He watched, with a mixture of disbelief and something close to envy, as this colleague simply stated, plainly and without strain, what he intended, and then turned his attention elsewhere entirely, as though the matter were already settled. The deeply held myth that effort and force alone determine outcome has shaped countless lives across countless generations, and yet the deepest and most lasting results have always come through another, far gentler mechanism, entirely one built on clear speech and calm trust, rather than continuous and exhausting strain. Force may occasionally produce a result, but it does so at tremendous cost, and often produces far less than calm and sincere speech would have produced on its own, left undisturbed. Millicent Rowe, an acquaintance of Everett's in the same town, continued forcing every area of her own life, long after noticing this same striking pattern playing out around her, watching others achieve with apparent ease what she herself continued to force with exhausting and often fruitless effort. She was not yet able to release a belief she had carried since her own childhood, however clearly the evidence around her seemed to contradict it. Consider how deeply you too may have absorbed this same myth across your own life, and consider, gently, what it might feel like to finally and genuinely set it down. Practice. Tonight, identify one area of your life where you have been forcing an outcome through sustained and exhausting effort, and consider what simply speaking it, plainly and without strain, might look like instead. Chapter 2. Speaking as the original act of creation, Harold Bixby, a clockmaker of considerable and quietly admired skill, reflected one evening on the many pieces he had crafted across his long career, and realized something he had never before articulated clearly to himself, that his finest and most enduring work had never begun with forceful hammering or anxious effort, but with a single, clear intention spoken quietly to himself before the work itself had even begun. He would sit, tools laid out before him, and simply state, in the privacy of his own workshop, exactly what he intended to create. Only then would his hands begin their careful and unhurried work. Speaking, plain and unforced, was once considered the original and entirely sufficient act of creation, long before force and struggle were ever added as supposedly necessary steps in a process that had never truly required them. Returning to this simpler and older manner of speaking restores a far more direct relationship with outcome than the exhausting habits of force could ever hope to provide. Constance Whitfield, a woman of considerable talent living in the same town as Harold, forgot this simpler manner entirely somewhere along the course of her own busy life, coming to believe instead that only relentless labor could ever produce anything worth having. She grew steadily wearier, year after exhausting year, trying to force what a single sentence, spoken plainly and with genuine sincerity, might once have accomplished for her with far greater ease. Consider what it might mean, in your own life, to return to speaking as a sufficient act in itself, rather than merely the first exhausting step in a much longer struggle. Practice. Tonight, speak one plain, unforced sentence about a current desire without adding any effort or strain behind it, and notice how this simplicity feels compared to your usual habit of striving. Chapter 3. Why questioning undoes what speaking creates. Joseph Kettering spoke a clear and genuinely sincere statement about his own future one particular evening, offering it with real conviction into the quiet of his own room. And yet, in the days that followed, he found himself anxiously questioning, again and again, whether the universe had truly received his words, turning the matter over obsessively in his mind, searching for reassurance, wondering whether he had spoken correctly, whether he had believed sincerely enough, whether anything at all had genuinely changed as a result of his speaking. He did not realize, in all his anxious questioning, that this very questioning was quietly unraveling what his original speaking had already accomplished. Questioning the universe's response quietly undoes the very words just spoken, for such questioning reintroduces precisely the doubt that clear and sincere speech had, for one genuine moment, fully and completely set aside. To speak with conviction, and then immediately begin questioning that conviction, is to take back with one hand what the other hand had only just offered. Thomas Ainsley, an acquaintance of Joseph's, spoke his own statement one evening with similar sincerity and then deliberately refrained from questioning it further, resisting the urge to seek reassurance or confirmation in the days that followed. He found his own results arriving with far greater ease than in his earlier and more anxious attempts, when questioning had so often followed close behind his speaking. Consider whether you have habitually questioned your own spoken intentions immediately after voicing them, undoing through anxious doubt what sincere speech had only just accomplished. Practice. Tonight, speak one statement about a genuine desire, and consciously refrain from any questioning of it afterward, resisting the urge to seek reassurance or proof. Chapter 4. The Exhaustion of Constant Forcing. Nathaniel Cobb, a hard-working laborer of considerable diligence, forced every circumstance of his own life through sheer and continuous strain, believing firmly that this was simply what life required of a man determined to improve his lot. And yet he found himself, despite years of such relentless and exhausting effort, more depleted with each passing season, and no genuinely further ahead than when he had first begun his long struggle. Forcing an outcome drains a person's inner resources long before it ever produces the result being so forcefully pursued. And this very exhaustion often becomes the true and quiet obstacle, preventing the outcome from arriving at all. For a depleted and strained inner state rarely attracts the ease it so desperately seeks. Margaret Ellery, a bookkeeper working not far from Nathaniel, noticed her own constant forcing, leaving her progressively more depleted with each passing month, and began experimenting, largely out of sheer and honest fatigue, with simply speaking her intentions instead of continuing to force them. She found, to her genuine surprise, that this far less exhausting approach produced noticeably better results than all her previous years of straining effort ever had. Consider how much of your own exhaustion may stem from the forcing itself, rather than from the genuine difficulty of the goals you have been pursuing. Practice. Tonight, identify one area of forced effort in your own life and consciously set the force down for today, allowing yourself the rest that constant forcing has denied you. Chapter 5. The universe does not negotiate, it responds. Charlie Dunmore spent many years of his adult life attempting to bargain and negotiate with his own circumstances, offering promises of future effort and future sacrifice in exchange for present relief from his difficulties, as though the universe itself might be persuaded by such careful and anxious negotiation. Only slowly, and after many years of this exhausting bargaining, did he come to realize that no such negotiation had ever truly been necessary, nor had it ever proven genuinely effective in producing the results he sought. There is nothing to bargain for, since the universe does not negotiate terms in the way a cautious merchant might, but simply responds, faithfully and without argument, to what is spoken with genuine and sincere conviction. All such bargaining, however earnestly undertaken, is an unnecessary and ultimately quite empty exercise, offered to a listener that was never actually negotiating in the first place. Ruth Callahan, an acquaintance of Charlie's in the same modest town, ceased her own habitual bargaining one determined season, choosing instead to simply state her intention plainly and without qualification, and found her results arriving without any of the anxious negotiation she had previously believed was necessary to secure them. Consider whether you have been attempting to bargain with your own circumstances, offering promises, making deals, negotiating terms, rather than simply and plainly speaking to them. Practice. Tonight, identify one area of habitual bargaining in your own life and replace it with a single plain statement instead, offered without qualification or negotiation. Chapter 6. Force as a Sign of Doubt. Abigail Sutter, a farmer's wife of reflective temperament, they noticed something curious about her own inner life over the course of many seasons, that her most forceful efforts always seemed to arise from her most doubtful moments, while her calmest and most confident statements required no force whatsoever behind them to feel genuinely complete. Every act of forcing conceals, quietly beneath its surface, a doubt that speaking alone will ever be sufficient to produce the desired outcome. Recognizing one's own force as a signal of this underlying doubt becomes a genuinely valuable diagnostic tool along this entire path, allowing the doubt itself to be addressed directly rather than endlessly compensated for through further and more exhausting effort. Franklin Odell, a neighbor of Abigail's, noticed his own forceful efforts intensifying precisely in proportion to his own underlying and largely unexamined doubt, and began, once he recognized this pattern clearly, addressing that doubt directly instead of continuing to force against it with ever-increasing and ultimately futile effort. Consider what doubt your own habitual forcing might be quietly revealing to you, if only you paused long enough to examine it honestly. Practice. Tonight, trace one instance of your own forcing back to the doubt beneath it, naming that doubt plainly to yourself rather than continuing to compensate for it through further effort. Chapter 7. The words that require no struggle behind them. Old farmer Silas Whitcomb noticed, across many years of careful observation, that his simplest and most direct statements of intention seemed to carry more quiet power than his most elaborate and effortful attempts at persuasion, however carefully those more elaborate attempts had been constructed. Certain words, spoken plainly and entirely without strain, carry more true power than years of anxious effort poured into more elaborate language. For simplicity, spoken with genuine conviction outweighs considerable complexity, spoken with underlying doubt. Bertha Lindquist, a neighbor of Silas's, continued crafting increasingly elaborate and effortful statements of her own desires, adding qualification upon qualification, elaboration upon elaboration, never once suspecting that a single plain sentence, spoken with genuine sincerity, might have served her considerably better than all her careful and exhausting construction. Consider simplifying your own spoken intentions rather than continuing to elaborate upon them with ever more careful and effortful language. Practice. Tonight, distill one desire into a single plain sentence, spoken without elaboration, and notice the difference this simplicity produces. Chapter 8. Releasing the Burden of Making It Happen. Louisa Marsh, a young teacher of considerable dedication, carried for many years the exhausting private belief that she alone must personally engineer every outcome she desired, down to its smallest and most exacting detail, as though the universe itself would fail her entirely should she ever relax her constant vigilance. Only after many years of this exhausting private burden did she finally begin to wonder whether it had ever truly been hers to carry in the first place. You were never meant to personally engineer every outcome you desire, down to its smallest detail. Releasing this exhausting burden of making it happen opens the way for a far lighter and considerably more effective approach built on sincere speech and genuine trust rather than constant and exhausting personal oversight. Amos Whitfield, an acquaintance of Louisa's, continued insisting on personally engineering every detail of his own desired outcomes, refusing to release any portion of the burden to trust or to time, and found himself perpetually exhausted by a weight he was never actually required to carry entirely alone. Consider setting down this exhausting burden, at least for one specific desire you have been carrying. Practice. Tonight, consciously set down the burden of personally engineering one specific outcome, offering it instead to trust. Chapter 9. Trusting the space after you speak. Daniel Prescott spoke a clear and sincere intention one particular evening, and then, out of old and deeply worn habit, immediately began trying to control exactly what should happen next, planning, arranging, anticipating every possible obstacle, entirely unaware that this very control was quietly undoing the trust his own speaking had required in order to work. What happens after speaking is not the reader's to control, only to trust, and this trust in the unseen space following one's own words is every bit as essential a part of this practice as the words themselves ever were. Clara Bishop spoke her own intention one evening, and then deliberately released any need to control what followed it, resisting her own old habit of immediate planning and anticipation, and found her results unfolding with a naturalness her earlier and more controlling attempts had never once achieved. Consider whether you have been undermining your own spoken intentions by attempting to control what follows them, rather than trusting that space to unfold on its own. Practice. Tonight, speak one intention, and then consciously trust the space that follows it, without attempting to control what comes next. Chapter 10. Your first unforced word. A young orchard keeper named Edwin Talmage, after many years of anxious striving over his crop, one evening spoke a single plain sentence about the harvest he expected, entirely without strain or elaboration, and felt, as he spoke it, an unfamiliar lightness he had never before experienced in all his years of anxious tending. The moment a person speaks even once, plainly and without straining, marks the true beginning of this entire practice, setting in motion a different and considerably gentler current than force could ever hope to create. A doubting neighbor named Wallace Pruitt continued forcing his own efforts despite hearing of Edwin's experience firsthand, unwilling to attempt so seemingly simple a practice himself, considering it too modest to genuinely matter. Recognize that you now stand ready to speak your own first unforced word. Practice. To close this first part of your journey, speak one plain, unforced word or sentence about a desire without any strain behind it whatsoever. Act 2. The sacred practice of speaking without forcing. Chapter 11. The stillness required to simply speak. Homer Fairweather, a night watchman who spent long and solitary hours through the quiet darkness of his working shifts, discovered something curious about his own words over many months of careful self-observation, that they carried noticeably more weight and considerably more clarity when spoken from a calm and settled inner state, rather than from his usual hurried and anxious mood that so often followed him through his busy days. A calm, unforced inner state must generally be reached before words carry their full and unstrained power, and speaking from agitation, however sincere the underlying intention may genuinely be, rarely produces the same quiet effectiveness as speaking from genuine stillness. It is not that agitated speech fails entirely. It is simply that it must labor against its own inner noise in a way that calm speech never has to. Vera Applegate, a woman of restless and rather anxious temperament, spoke her own intentions hurriedly and amid nearly constant inner agitation, rushing through her words as though eager to be done with them, and wondered, with growing frustration, why her words seemed to carry so little real and lasting weight compared to those spoken by calmer acquaintances around her. Consider cultivating a calm inner state before speaking your own intentions going forward, rather than rushing into speech from the midst of your own daily agitation. Practice. Tonight, before speaking your intention, practice a brief stillness exercise, settling your breath, softening your shoulders, releasing the hurry of your day, and then speak from within that calm. Chapter 12. Speaking at once, completely. Augustus Hartwell, a modest clerk of quiet habits, experimented one particular evening with speaking his intention only once, but with full and complete conviction behind it, rather than continuing his previous habit of repeating it many times throughout the day out of anxious and unexamined uncertainty. One clear, complete statement, spoken fully and with genuine conviction, replaces entirely the need for constant, repeated effort. For repetition offered from anxiety very often signals doubt rather than genuinely reinforcing true and settled belief. Percival Dodd continued repeating his own intention many times each day, purely out of habitual and long-standing anxiety, and found this constant repetition leaving him progressively more uncertain rather than more genuinely confident, as though each repetition were quietly confessing that the previous one had not truly been believed. Consider whether a single complete statement, offered once with real conviction, might serve you considerably better than continued anxious repetition offered many times over. Practice. Tonight, speak one intention fully and completely, just once, resisting the urge to repeat it further. Chapter 13. The Danger of Speaking and Then Pushing. Josephine Carter, a schoolteacher of careful reflection, spoke a clear and sincere intention one particular evening, offering it with genuine conviction into the quiet of her own room. And yet, in the weeks that followed, she found herself pushing anxiously against her own circumstances, trying with considerable effort to force that same intention along toward its fulfillment, unknowingly undoing much of what her original and sincere speaking had already quietly accomplished. Speaking a desire, and then continuing to push against circumstance, undoes much of what the speaking itself had already set in motion. For this subsequent pushing reintroduces precisely the force that sincere speech was always meant to replace. Elmer Griggs spoke his own intention with similar sincerity, and then deliberately refrained from any further pushing whatsoever, allowing his circumstances to unfold entirely on their own without his anxious interference, and found his results arriving with considerably greater ease as a direct result of this restraint. Consider whether you have been undoing your own spoken words by continuing to push against circumstance afterward, rather than trusting the words themselves to do their quiet work. Practice. Tonight, notice one habitual instance of pushing after speaking, and consciously refrain from it, allowing your words to stand alone. Chapter 14. Feeling the words as you say them. Delphine Hargrove, a widow of reflective temperament, noticed something instructive about her own nightly practice, that speaking the very same sentence with genuine feeling behind it produced an entirely different and considerably more powerful result than speaking those same exact words as hollow, mechanical recitation offered from mere habit alone. Genuine feeling behind spoken words is what truly separates effective speaking from empty recitation offered out of habit, and this feeling, far more than the precise words themselves, carries the true and lasting weight of this entire practice. Cornelius Beadle recited his own intentions nightly in a flat and rather mechanical tone, entirely devoid of any real feeling behind the familiar words, and wondered, with growing frustration, why his careful and consistent words seemed to produce so remarkably little visible change in his circumstances. Examine whether your own spoken words have carried genuine feeling behind them, or only hollow repetition offered from mere habit. Practice. Tonight, speak one sentence with deliberate, genuine feeling behind each word, rather than reciting it mechanically. Chapter 15. Letting silence follow the word. Rosalind Fenwick began deliberately allowing a period of complete and genuine silence to follow each spoken intention, rather than immediately moving on to other thoughts or activities as she had always done before, and noticed her own words seeming to settle more deeply and more completely as a direct result of this simple and deliberate pause. After speaking, silence itself becomes an essential part of the practice, allowing the spoken word to settle undisturbed rather than being immediately crowded out by other and unrelated mental activity rushing in to fill the space. Herbert Yancey spoke his own intentions, and then immediately filled the following moments with unrelated and busy thought, never once allowing his words the genuine silence they required in order to settle fully within him. Consider allowing a period of deliberate silence to follow your own spoken words going forward, rather than rushing immediately into other thoughts. Practice. Tonight, speak one intention, followed by a brief period of deliberate and complete silence. Chapter 16. Catching Yourself Mid-Force. Wendell Ashcroft learned, gradually and through patient self-observation, to notice the exact physical and mental sensations that accompanied the precise moment he began, forcing an outcome, a tightening in his chest, a quickening of his thoughts, a subtle clenching he had never before thought to notice. Catching himself mid-force with increasing regularity over time, he began choosing, in that very moment of noticing, to release rather than to continue. Learning to notice the precise moment force begins allows a person to release it before it fully and completely takes hold, and this noticing itself becomes a genuinely valuable and trainable skill over time, sharpening with patient and consistent practice. Adelaide Crum failed to notice her own forcing until it had already fully and completely taken hold within her, finding it considerably more difficult to release at that later and more entrenched stage than it would ever have been at its very earliest onset. Consider learning to notice your own earliest signs of forcing, catching them before they fully take root. Practice. Tonight, notice the earliest physical or mental sensation of forcing as it arises, and gently release it in that very moment. Chapter 17. The Evening Practice of Speaking and Releasing. Reginald Thorpe, a modest bank teller of steady habits, assembled a brief evening practice combining plain and unforced speech with full and complete release, repeating this simple two-part practice faithfully each night without significant variation, and found that its very consistency became every bit as powerful as any single evening's individual practice. A brief evening practice of speaking plainly and then releasing fully becomes the true and lasting foundation of this entire approach, transforming what might otherwise remain a single, occasional insight into a dependable and reliably repeatable habit. Mabel Truscott practiced speaking and releasing only occasionally, whenever she happened to remember to do so amid her busy days, and found her own results just as inconsistent as her own sporadic and irregular practice. Consider the true value of a consistent evening practice, combining both sincere speech and complete release. Practice. Tonight, assemble your own brief evening practice of speaking one intention and then fully releasing it, resolving to repeat it faithfully. Chapter 18. Picturing without straining toward it. Clarence Whitlock discovered that picturing his own desired outcome calmly and rather loosely, without straining to force the image into ever greater and more exacting detail, produced a considerably more settled and effective visualization than his earlier and more effortful attempts had ever managed to achieve. A calm mental picture, held loosely rather than gripped tightly through intense and strained effort, works far more effectively than strained and effortful visualization, for the strain itself introduces precisely the force this entire practice seeks so carefully to avoid. Sylvia Duquette strained intensely to force ever more vivid and exacting detail into her own visualizations, laboring over each image as though sheer effort alone might will it into being, and found this constant straining leaving her considerably more anxious and considerably less trusting than a looser and gentler approach might otherwise have allowed her to feel. Consider picturing your own desired outcome more loosely and more calmly than you may have allowed yourself before this evening. Practice. Tonight, hold a loose, calm visualization of one desired outcome, resisting the urge to strain for greater detail. Chapter 19. Gratitude spoken, not forced. Winifred Pemberton began offering brief and plainly spoken gratitude each night for an outcome not yet visible in her circumstances, taking real care to speak this gratitude simply and honestly, rather than forcing herself to feel more enthusiasm or more excitement than she genuinely and honestly held within her at that moment. Genuine gratitude, spoken simply and honestly, seals what forced or exaggerated gratitude never truly could, for forced feeling of any kind carries within it the very same underlying strain as any other form of forcing, however positively that forcing may be dressed. Leonard Fitch forced an exaggerated display of gratitude each night that he did not genuinely and honestly feel, performing enthusiasm rather than offering it sincerely, and found this forced gratitude producing far less real and lasting effect than simple, honest acknowledgement might have provided him instead. Consider offering simple, honest gratitude, rather than forced or exaggerated feeling you do not genuinely hold. Practice. Tonight, speak simple, honest thanks for one outcome not yet visible, without forcing more enthusiasm than you genuinely feel. Chapter 20. Waking without the urge to push. Beatrice Langford noticed that greeting each morning with her own old and familiar urge to immediately push and strive seemed to undo, in a matter of mere moments, the calm and unforced speaking she had so carefully practiced the evening before. Meeting each morning without the old urge to push preserves what was calmly spoken the previous night, while an immediate return to old and familiar forceful habits quickly unravels that same calm foundation before the day has even properly begun. Roscoe Bellamy woke each morning, immediately reverting to his own old habit of forceful striving, undoing in mere moments the calm and careful practice he had completed so faithfully the night before. Consider how you typically greet your own mornings, and whether this habitual greeting preserves or quietly undoes your unforced practice. Practice. To close this second part of your journey, greet tomorrow morning without your old urge to push, allowing the calm of the previous night to carry forward undisturbed. Act 3. Living without forcing. Chapter 21. The quiet signs that speaking is working. Silas Merriweather began noticing small and unforced changes appearing quietly in his own circumstances shortly after taking up this practice in earnest, though he very nearly dismissed each one at first as ordinary and unremarkable coincidence, unworthy of any real attention or genuine credit. Small, unforced changes often mark the earliest and most reliable proof that simply speaking has begun to work, and learning to notice these quiet signs, however modest they may initially appear, strengthens considerably the trust that allows this entire practice to continue deepening over time. Ophelia Rundgren noticed similar small changes arising in her own life around this same period, but dismissed each one as unimportant and unrelated to her own quiet practice, and so failed to nourish the very trust that might otherwise have carried her considerably further along this same gentle path. Consider what small, unforced changes may already be appearing in your own life since beginning this practice, changes you may have been too quick to dismiss. Practice. Tonight, note one small, unforced change you have noticed since beginning your practice, however minor it may at first appear to you. Chapter 22. Becoming someone who no longer needs to force. Horace Pemberley, a struggling grocer of otherwise unremarkable standing, stopped asking how much effort a given outcome would require of him, and instead began quietly becoming the kind of person who genuinely trusts speech alone, adjusting his own inner bearing, rather than continuing to adjust his outward striving. Lasting ease comes from becoming a person who genuinely trusts speech alone, rather than continuing to force quietly behind the scenes while merely appearing calm on the outward surface presented to others. Prudence Alderman spoke calmly on the surface of her own life while continuing to force anxiously behind the scenes, hiding her true effort from view, and found her results remaining just as strained and just as difficult as her own hidden and unacknowledged effort had always been. Consider whether your own outward calm has been genuinely matched by inward trust, or whether force continues quietly and unacknowledged behind it. Practice. Tonight, examine honestly whether any hidden forcing remains behind your own outward calm, and gently release it where you find it. Chapter 23. When the old urge to force creeps back. Eugene Halloway, well along in his own sincere practice, was startled one particularly difficult week to find his old and familiar urge to force and strain rising up again within him as strongly as it had ever been, particularly under the pressure of unexpected circumstances he had not anticipated. The old habit of forcing may briefly return, especially and predictably under stress, and this return is not genuine failure, however discouraging it may feel in the moment of its arrival, but simply an old and familiar pattern surfacing once more to be met, calmly and patiently, with the same release practiced so faithfully before. Henrietta Coswell mistook this same brief return of forcing as certain proof that her entire practice had failed, and abandoned it altogether in genuine and rather premature discouragement, precisely at the moment when continued and patient practice would have carried her safely through. Recognize the brief return of the old forcing urge as entirely ordinary, should it arise in your own practice, rather than as any genuine and lasting failure. Practice. Tonight, practice a brief, calming exercise for the moment the old urge to force briefly resurfaces within you. Chapter 24. The patience required to simply wait. An old vintner named Solomon Whitlock understood, from a long lifetime spent among his casks and his careful cellars, that fine wine cannot be hurried toward its full maturity through any amount of impatient attention, however eager the waiting drinker might genuinely become in the meantime. He came, in time, to compare this same quiet patience to the waiting required after speaking rather than forcing. Not forcing requires a patience many find considerably harder than any amount of active effort, for waiting without pushing runs directly counter to nearly every habit of striving. Most people have spent an entire lifetime carefully building within themselves. Young Marigold Ash abandoned her own unforced practice after only a few days, finding the simple act of waiting considerably harder to sustain than her previous and more familiar habits of active forcing had ever been for her. Consider your own capacity for this particular and unfamiliar kind of patience, and practice it deliberately rather than avoiding it. Practice. Tonight, offer yourself a quiet reminder, affirming patience with the unseen timing of your own unforced speaking. Chapter 25. Guarding your words from those who insist on struggle. Josephine Kavanagh noticed that spending time with a particularly striving and effort-obsessed acquaintance left her own calm and unforced practice feeling suddenly foolish and insufficient by comparison, as though she had somehow been neglecting some important duty by simply speaking rather than struggling. Others, who believe firmly only in force, may quietly pressure the reader back into old and exhausting habits, whether or not they intend to do so. And guarding one's own calm practice from this quiet pressure is an important and genuinely ongoing part of sustaining it over time. Bartholomew Rees surrounded himself constantly with such striving and effort-obsessed company, absorbing their doubts about ease as though they were entirely his own, and found his own calm practice steadily eroding the longer he remained willingly in their demanding presence. Consider whose company may be quietly pressuring you back toward old and exhausting habits of force. Practice. Tonight, identify one such influence in your own life, and consider a small boundary that could protect your calm practice. Chapter 26. Not forcing in relationships and opportunity. Frederick Lansing noticed that as his own calm and unforced manner of speaking grew more consistent through steady practice, favorable people and unexpected opportunities alike began approaching him with an ease he had never previously achieved through any amount of direct and effortful pursuit. The same calm, unforced speech shaping one's material desires also shapes how others and opportunity respond in turn, for force and strain in one area of life rarely stay contained neatly to that single area alone. Agatha Winslow continued forcing her relationships and pursuing opportunity aggressively even while practicing calm speech elsewhere in her life, and found these particular forced areas remaining stubbornly resistant despite her genuine progress in other, more relaxed areas of her practice. Consider extending your own unforced practice into relationships and opportunity as well, rather than confining it to a single area alone. Practice. Tonight, extend today's unforced speech to include one relationship or opportunity you have been forcing. Chapter 27. When Nothing Seems to Happen After Speaking. Aloysius Grant spoke a clear and sincere intention one particular evening, and when nothing visible seemed to change for some weeks afterward, grew steadily convinced that his own speaking must have somehow failed. Only some time later did he discover that his words had, in genuine fact, been quietly at work all along, simply unfolding on a timeline he had not anticipated or fully understood in advance. An apparent lack of response is rarely a true sign that speaking has genuinely failed, but far more often simply an indication that its proper and unhurried timing has not yet arrived. Beatrice Noloth abandoned her own spoken intention after a period of apparent inactivity, growing discouraged by the visible silence that followed her words, only to learn much later that her results had, in fact, been quietly unfolding all along beneath a surface she had not thought to trust. Consider whether you have mistaken, quiet, ongoing unfolding for genuine failure in the past. Practice. Tonight, reconsider one apparently unanswered intention as possibly still quietly unfolding beneath the surface. Chapter 28. Those Who Simply Spoke Before You. An old harbor pilot named Ezra Thornbury achieved quiet and genuinely unshakable results that others around him attributed simply to good fortune. Though he privately maintained a lifelong habit of speaking his own intentions plainly and then never forcing them any further, quiet figures throughout history achieved, through calm and unforced speech, precisely what others exhausted themselves trying desperately to force, leaving faint traces of this quiet practice in old letters and family memory for those willing to look closely enough to find them. A young descendant named Charlotte Thornbury discovered her ancestor's private journal many years after his passing and recognized, with quiet astonishment, the very practice she had only just learned herself in these pages, recorded there in his own careful hand decades before her own birth. Consider what quiet, unforced results may exist, unrecognized until now, somewhere within your own family history. Practice. Reflect briefly this evening on one such quiet result from your own life or lineage. Chapter 29. Teaching Others to Stop Forcing. Clementine Marsh gently shared this calm and unforced practice with a struggling friend still caught firmly in old habits of exhausting effort, and found her own trust deepening considerably as she guided her friend gently toward this same quiet discovery. Helping another person release their own habit of forcing deepens the teacher's own trust in simply speaking, for what is shared with genuine sincerity becomes more firmly rooted within the one who shares it than it ever was before the sharing began. Ambrose Fenwick kept his own calm practice entirely to himself, never once sharing it with anyone around him, and found his own progress growing strangely and rather inexplicably stagnant as a direct result of this quiet withholding. Consider whether there is someone in your own life you might gently help release their own habit of forcing. Practice. Identify one person with whom you might gently share a single teaching from this book. Chapter 30. The Voice That No Longer Needs to Try. An aged Rutherford Blake found that this calm, unforced manner of speaking had become so entirely natural to him across so many years of faithful practice that his own words now seemed simply to arrange his circumstances around him without any conscious effort or deliberate reminder required at all. Once this practice is truly learned and genuinely lived over time, speaking without forcing becomes so natural that it requires no conscious effort whatsoever, continuing of its own accord as the settled rhythm of a mind that has fully and completely released the need to strain. A young seeker named Wilhelmina Foss visited old Rutherford one quiet afternoon and asked him the secret of his remarkable and quiet ease, only to be told simply that he no longer tries not to force, for trust and release have become, over so many years, as natural to him as breathing itself. Imagine your own future self, for whom this unforced voice requires no more effort than simply being. Practice. To close this third and final part of your journey, envision your own life, years from now, having lived this unforced practice so long that speaking, not forcing, has simply become your natural way of living. Epilogue. You now carry a quiet knowledge, once easily lost amid so much exhausting effort, that force was never the true source of what you had been seeking, and that your own plain, unforced voice has been enough all along, however long it took you to discover this. Consider the distance already traveled. From the first exhausted habits of forcing to this final and settled, calm trust in simple speech. Your own unforced words have already begun their quiet work, whether or not outward proof has yet fully appeared before your waking eyes. Nothing more needs to be forced, only spoken. You may now simply speak, release, and trust the results already quietly underway.